I'm based at the Royal Veterinary College in London. I'm a Professor of Animal Health Economics in the college, and I want to talk to you about the systems context of surveillance. What I want to go through is a little bit of an overview of the issues that I think are important with regards to driving surveillance, and the need to constantly consider the social and political and economic context in which we operate. So let's start with a sort of gentle introduction. Why should we invest in surveillance? This is a question that we're constantly being challenged by our policymakers, the people with resources. The obvious answer is that we need to find disease very fast, respond to it. In certain situations, we need to determine if a disease has gone from an area or from a population in order to actually demonstrate to people that we can trade. We might want to generate pathogen isolates in order to understand the evolution of the pathogens and the mechanisms in which they're actually evolving due to our own changes of the environment or the animals we keep. We might also want to think a bit more carefully about any kind of disease control program. How effective is it being, and what kind of things can we do better? And overall, we might want to say something about where to invest in our health system in general, both now and in the future. And this is an area that I think, generally speaking, we're probably quite weak on. We are pretty good on the sort of minutiae. We tend to know more and more about less and less, but we're not actually looking at the bigger picture in terms of where we will put resources in the future in order to improve our health system in general. But overall, my question is, will that investment in surveillance be static? And I think the answer is probably not. Surveillance needs to add value to decision making and actually give us some idea about why we should put resources and time in different parts of both the surveillance system and to some extent directing the resources and the time that we actually dedicate towards disease control and prevention issues. This level of investment will change because the way we value resources across the surveillance system will also change. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine if you went back to the 1950s in Europe, you'll find that a lot of people actually spent most of their time working in manual type jobs. They were paid relatively little money and had very little free time. Move forward by another 50 years, you'll find that most people in Europe, for example, have moved out of those manual type jobs. They have quite a lot of time on their hands and they're relatively well paid compared to our peers or our previous generations in terms of what they actually do. This wealth means that we place more value on human life, we place more value on human health. We've also changed the way in which we keep animals. And one of the biggest changes we've had, again in the last 50 years, is we've gone from systems where we ask animals to graze and scavenge for their food. We actually have changed that to where most of the animals we tend to keep and eat are actually fed with feed grains. And that's because these feed grains have become cheap across societies and we've encouraged their use in livestock production. With these changes in both human health, human values and animals, we've also seen a change in value of animals themselves. So pets, which we hold to be quite important in our urbanised living, have tended to increase in value across societies and become more important, whereas livestock, which we rarely see nowadays, have actually reduced in value compared to other goods in society. Now, with those changes in value, we need to think more carefully about where we may put resources in terms of surveillance. And I want to explore this a little bit around a decision-making process with a fairly simple classification. I want to think a bit about the trade-related animal disease issues, the unknowns that might occur from the way we keep animals in society, and also the endemic diseases that we have. In essence, I want to draw on the issue that endemics are actually a regular program for our animal owners, should actually be the core of any surveillance system, and therefore understanding the people's needs to actually keep animals should be the core to adding value through surveillance in general. So let's start with thinking about where we actually invest in surveillance and who actually does the monetary investment in that process. Trade-related surveillance is obviously very important for different reasons, and it reflects the fact that actually there's been an increasing trend towards animal movements and livestock product movements where we've got to check what's actually going on with regards to their disease status. This probably began quite a long time ago. It's not that recent, but it's become more important in terms of the information we can generate. And actually proving that you're free or you've actually eliminated transboundary diseases, things like foot and mouth disease, classical swine fever, avian influenza, is very important in terms of trading freely with other countries, both in terms of live animals and in terms of product. So surveillance adds a great deal of value in terms of demonstrating freedom and allows trading countries to actually continue that trade, and therefore it's a major priority. In addition, if we're free of a disease, but there's a risk that we might import the pathogen from somewhere else, then detection of a trade-related disease becomes very important in general, in terms of actually setting off a series of processes with regards to control and elimination of that pathogen. Now that may mean vaccination, which obviously requires additional resources and diversion from other activities, or it may involve test and slaughter of animals that have impacts across the economy. Now the costs of these activities for the trade-related diseases are generally speaking underwritten by governments. What do I mean by that? Well, if the disease occurs, then governments will pay the costs for the mitigation actions that I've described above. Therefore, if we can limit those mitigation activities and reduce their costs, then the governments have a benefit in terms of avoiding the costs that might be incurred. Therefore, a surveillance system that's very sensitive and can detect disease very early and therefore limit the exposure to the consequences of that disease become very important. And governments, therefore, will almost invariably want to spend money on surveillance with regards to trade-related diseases. What about the unknowns? We've had quite a few of those in the last 20 years. So we've had the emergence of things like BSE, which has created a whole new range of pathogens which we weren't aware of. SARS, MERS. To some extent you might put avian influenza in this category. Now, these issues can affect a range of species, including humans. And the value of actually detecting them early becomes very high because basically we don't quite know what they're going to do. We don't know what the consequences of these diseases are. And so having systems in place, surveillance systems in place that are actually sensitive to identifying unusual patterns becomes quite critical with the unknowns. And these diseases create burdens for a society in different ways, and in particular for governments. So if we take the example of SARS, which actually created a shutdown of economic activity across a wide geographical area of Asia, they have impact on the economy, and therefore if they reduce economic activity, they also reduce tax collection issues. So government loses out in terms of how much money it can draw. And if they're present, they create additional costs in terms of surveillance, control and prevention. Now, at the worst case scenario, we have a disease that actually causes major losses in terms of human life as well as livestock production. At the other end, we may have diseases like Schmallenberg, where there isn't any human health impact, and this generates a lower response and lower level of impact. But in general, what I'd say is that these unknowns are of such importance and such unknown consequences that governments will invest quite a lot of money in terms of having surveillance systems that are actually sensitive to their early detection. Now, the final category that I want to look at are the endemics, and these are quite a ragbag range of different things. They could be very localized issues in terms of parasite management, and they could be problems that affect society as a whole. Now, things like zoonotic and foodborne diseases would probably receive most attention in terms of surveillance, and the reasons for that are relatively obvious with regards to what I've said earlier. They affect humans who are highly valued in society, therefore you would anticipate that a lot of activity will be done in that regard. But in addition, there's quite a lot of diseases that are known to be present in livestock, and yet our surveillance systems at the moment are not very well designed to actually generate any information about them. And there are two things that we're lacking in this sense. One is our ability to actually determine their impact in terms of what's actually present, what is a prevalence or incidence of these diseases, and what do they do when the disease actually is in the populations. So that's unknown. And in addition, our surveillance systems are not capturing the animal owners' responses to these diseases in terms of prevention or control measures. Now, for governments in general, a number of these diseases are not that important, and they're classified in a group that we call not notifiable, which means basically from a legislation point of view, governments will not underwrite the costs of prevention or control. And in general, they will not spend a lot of money on surveillance. These diseases in general have no major implications on trade, so their impact is not seen as that important. Now, I would argue this creates a real weakness in our system of surveillance, because these diseases do create an economic impact at individual level. And generally speaking, our animal owners have an interest in the better management of endemics. And this weakness actually creates a problem in terms of our ability to review and update disease priorities at a societal level. So, in summary, where do we go with this kind of problem? Well, I just want to reflect a little bit on what I would classify as being the impacts of disease. Some of these impacts are around visible losses, which are around people dying or animals dying. There can be invisible losses, which are about fertility changes or population changes. And some of the impacts are around how we respond in terms of what we spend on disease control, disease management, disease surveillance, and also what revenue we might lose due to trade issues. Combined, these are the impacts of the health issue that we're looking at, or the disease issue. And on the left-hand side, as we look at the screen, we have one side which is the impact caused by diseases and health problems. And on the other side, we have the impact caused by human reaction. Now, in economic terms, every time we spend €1 on the impact caused by human reaction, we're anticipating we'll get a return of avoided losses on the health side to the left. Okay, at least €1 back. And it's balancing those two things together which becomes important. And our surveillance system provides us information which allows us to say something about health impact on both sides of this particular relationship. And that's an important aspect of the information we should be generating. So what exactly are we generating at the moment in terms of our overall health systems? Well, we have the global burden of human disease, which we know has been done twice. We have the World Livestock Disease Atlas, which has been done once, based on FAO and FAOStat data, which is probably not that reliable. And we have a recently published global burden of foodborne disease. So we have some information about burdens. In terms of costs, we have human health costs published by the WHO and the national statistics. We have pet health costs, which are being collected by national statistics departments. And we have a little bit of information around animal health through the PVS scheme run by OIE, but it's not complete. Now, one of the weaknesses with regards looking at the impacts of diseases and health problems is largely around the animal diseases and animal health problems. We do not have a very good handle on the global burden of animal diseases, and we do not have a very good understanding of the costs of our responses to animal disease and animal health problems. It's simply not published. Now, with that kind of gap, and with the fact that we know that the way we use animals is evolving and changing, it means that we actually need to get better data in terms of understanding health burdens, how they're altering, how we're responding to them. We need data around populations, their health, and also the circulating pathogens within those populations. If we have that data, then we can start to think a bit about sensible resource allocation that actually maximizes our benefits from animals and minimizes the negatives. And what I would say in general is that we need some kind of institutional change with resource allocations towards the ecology of the systems we live in, rather than just simply a human-based health system. But to do that, we need to have veterinarians that have skills in economics and social sciences to understand changes that are ongoing, and we also need them to have these skills to actually influence change. So what would I say is my ideal system? Well, if we've got susceptible animal populations, and we've got the people who are living alongside them, the animal owners, the animal keepers, There's constant interaction between those people and their populations, their animal populations. And our surveillance system needs to reflect that actually this is a general thing. It's actually looking at disease, but looking at disease within a socioeconomic context, looking at how the livestock sector is evolving, how we're using wildlife. And this interaction of the surveillance system needs to be built around a surveillance network. And in the process, if it's successful, it should be generating pathogen banks, which allow us to develop and assess vaccines and diagnostics. It should develop data which allows us to do analysis, epidemiological analysis and some economic analysis. And in that process helps us to make decisions around which diagnostics do we need to improve and why. What types of active disease searching do we need to do and why? What is the cost of that process? And in general, it should actually allow us to do the rational and proportionate disease control measures which we desire in terms of limiting what people are spending on disease management and maximising the benefits of actually keeping animals in society. So overall, we have animals in society, in the sector. We have disease circulating within those populations. We can propose reasonable disease prevention and control strategies and cost them and look at their cost effectiveness. We can think a bit about disease impact assessments and lead towards a cost-benefit analysis or a sustainability assessment or a justification of change, which is based on data, based on science-based evidence, to lead towards policy dialogue, lead towards evidence-based policy rather than policy-driving evidence that we're collecting. So the key messages from this is that we need the need for evidence, which requires a surveillance system to collect and analyse data on species and their production systems, estimate the losses in production and our reaction to the presence of disease. Through that process, assess the weaknesses in technologies we're using and their prices, and overall provide information about where we have weaknesses in the overall health system. Now, if we do that carefully, we can present business cases back to policymakers, back to livestock producers, back to people with resources, so we can have strategic investments both in the health system and the surveillance of that health system. And in that manner, we're actually using best scientific practice to monitor and do advocacy in how we work and how we're actually improving health in general across society. So our surveillance system must constantly engage our animal owners and ensure they participate to actually achieve these types of goals. Thank you very much for your time. These are my contact details. If anybody's got any questions or would like to discuss anything, please get in touch. Thank you.